today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors.
This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So we are continuing on in our series called Prayer Power, and in this series over the last few weeks we've looked at the Lord's Prayer. Okay, and so in the first week we looked at some of the verses leading up to the Lord's Prayer, some of the things that Jesus said, you know what, don't do this when you pray. Don't stand on a corner and expect everybody to look at you. Thank you. He also talked about, you know what, don't babble on and on and on about things when you pray. And instead go to your secret spot. Go to that special place where you can pray. And then he says, you know what, you don't need to babble on and on and on because God already knows what you want. Excuse me, my throat is very scratchy this morning. And so last week, we began to look at some of the petitions found in the Lord's Prayer. Okay? And the first two petitions really deal with God and the things God desires. And so we looked at the address, Our Father. Okay? And we talked about the power of names in Jewish culture and just how important names were to the people. And in fact, when they would name a child, there was sometimes a prophetic expectation that went along with their names. Their names had meaning, and they were expected to live out those characteristics in their lives. And so we looked at some of the special names that they called God. And we saw the power in those names, and we saw the specific characteristics of those names for God. And so as we looked at that address, we were able to see that God is this infinite being, this powerful, sovereign God. And yet, Jesus says not only is he sovereign and infinite in his power, but you get to call him Abba Father. Okay, so we say Our Father. And so there's this beautiful combination, almost this paradox of this infinite creator God, and then this Abba Father, this Papa or Daddy, as we're able to call him. And they're joined together in this beautiful address. The next thing we looked at is where we're addressing. So we're addressing to God in the heavens. And we talked about the three different heavens in Jewish culture, the atmospheres, celestial places, and the heaven of heavens. And we talked about how often when we pray, we seem to think of God in the heaven of heavens, that place where God dwells. But in Jewish culture, with these three different heavens, it was that as if God was as close as our very breath, that God was in the very atmosphere that we breathe. Then we talked about glorifying his name. Hallowed be thy name. Okay, and again, not that his name isn't already holy, because it was so holy, and the Jewish people were so reverent about that some people wouldn't even say the names of God. Okay? And so we just ask and we petition God that his name may be glorified among us all and on this earth. And then we talked about thy kingdom come and thy will be done. And we talked about, again, this idea of kingdoms. And I shared with you my personal kingdom. So my kingdom that persists of my family, persists of the work I do, both here at both of these churches and even at a state level within our denomination. And we said that a kingdom is basically anything that we have a say over. And so all of us have kingdoms. And so we talked about, when we say our kingdom come and thy will be done, we talked about the fact that in heaven, God's will is just the rule of the day. Anything God wills in heaven happens. Okay? But down here on earth, that's not always the case. Because of our free will, sometimes we go off in a different direction. Sometimes we set up kingdoms that are not in alignment with God and the things God desires. And so part of that prayer, part of that petition, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is asking God's kingdom to come and also move out some of those kingdoms that are not in alignment with his will. Okay? And then we ended our time, our message time, with a rather untraditional prayer exercise. And so I asked you all to take a Post-it note and fill it out and place it on or think of a special place within this church or something special you wanted to pray for this church on. Write it on the Post-it note and stick them places. And so if you're new or you're visiting today and you see Post-it notes by the doors or on stuff, know that that's what it's for. And so it was just really encouraging for me to go around and to see all of the things that you're praying for, to see where your hearts are, to see where you want to go as a church. And so I hope that you'll continue to pray for those areas that you've lifted up or those things that you put on the Post-it notes. If you didn't get one last week and you want to do it, we'll find more Post-it notes and we'll stick them up for the next week or so that we go through stuff. And so today, let's move into our discussion as we look at the next two petitions in our Lord's Prayer. And again, we move from addressing or requesting the things that God desires to making requests that are more personal in nature. And so, give us this day our daily bread. And it seems really easy when we step in and we say this prayer, but what does this really mean? Okay? And part of it, again, is it forms this framework of this prayer that we're dependent upon God. And we're not only dependent upon Him for the big things in our life, but we're dependent on God for even the small things. Now, we live in a culture that is very independent in nature. We want to do everything by ourselves. We strive and go. We think we're self-made people, and we get pretty high and lofty in our egos as we do this. But this prayer is designed to begin to strip that ego away. Give us today our daily bread. And so even though most of us like to think we can just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and all of the successes we have in life come from our own doing, if we stop and think for but a moment, just like that, everything can be taken away. And so we're not really so almighty and powerful as we like to think we are sometimes. And so, like I said, we need to begin to step into trust and step deeper into our faith that God will give us the things that we need. And so I'd like to talk a little bit again about the fall. So if we go back to the beginning of the Bible and we look at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we see this perfect, harmonious paradise where Adam and Eve just live in abundance. They're with God. They get to talk with God, walk with God, and life is really perfect. But as sin enters in, all of a sudden, that abundance turns into scarcity. Now we have to work for everything that we want. And so there's a tendency to work and work and work and try to hoard stuff, thinking that if we hoard all of this stuff, it'll give us the safety and the security that we desire. And so as we accumulate stuff, we become complacent. And this happens even in our churches. We begin a cycle of scarcity where we look at the declining nature in our mainline denominations. Some of you here will remember a time when our churches were full, and we look back and go, wow, we don't nearly have as many people as we used to. And now we're struggling to pay our bills, and now because we can't pay our bills, we're pulling money out of ministries. And because we're not doing ministries, people aren't coming, and it starts to create this very vicious cycle where we begin to cling to everything. Okay? And the problem is, we begin to look at each other not so much as people, but we begin to look at each other as objects. Because you know what? I can't afford for Karen to leave because she supports the church financially. And so rather than seeing Karen as a person and seeing the gifts she brings to ministry, I become worried about the dollars she puts in the offering plate every week. Okay? And that's not fair to her. And so part of this prayer, and especially for this church, is that we come in our faith that God will provide for our church today what we need for today. And we need to walk in that trust. We need not to look back, and we need not to look too far forward, but to be focused right on the present. Okay? And so, you know, I get this because I'm, in a way, I'm wired to look at the past. I have degrees in history, and one of my strengths as a leader when I did inventories was context. So I'm constantly looking to the past to try to figure out what's going on in the present and into the future. So I'm constantly working back here. So I have to be careful that I don't live back there, waiting and hoping for things of the glorious past to come again, but instead realize that maybe those seasons have passed and a new time is ushered in. Okay? And so likewise for the church. You know, there was a time where people came here for a lot of social reasons. People came to the church looking for security, looking for comfort in things, and that season may be past, and we need to go out to the people again in a new season of our church. Likewise, I'm also very goal-oriented, and so there's been times in my life where I just charge right after goals, and yet I've totally missed the entire journey. There's times that I've hurt relationships because I've become so focused on a certain goal, always looking to the future, always hoping that that goal will get me to someplace bigger and better, just so that I'll feel comfortable. And so this prayer is really a call to be present. And so one of the phrases that we use, or that I learned in some of the personal development work I did, was this idea of first day and last day mentality. And so what would it look like if we lived into this mentality where we approached each day as our very first day? All of the junk of the past is no more. We start with a brand new, clean slate. And what if we lived like this was our last day on earth? What are the things we would do and invest in if we knew that at 9 o'clock tonight it was all over? Okay? And that really begins to frame our mind to live in the present. Okay? In a few weeks ago, I did a sermon on gratitude, and we talked about Ann Voskam's work, and we looked at that short video that she did. And one of the phrases in that video that just continues to stick out to me is, she says, "How do I stay awake to the moments of my life?" Again, that first day mentality. How do I live into each and every moment that God has given me, whether they're good moments, whether they're ordinary moments, or whether they're the not so good moments that I prefer didn't happen. But how do I truly live in to each and every one of those? And how do I just allow God to give me the things I need to do? And then finally, again, there's this beautiful interplay in this petition of this idea of faith and works. Because as I told the kids, again, God will provide for us. Now, does that mean that we maybe just open our mouths like little birds and God just drops stuff into our mouths? Maybe. There might be times that God works in mysterious ways. Okay, there was a time in my life when things weren't so easy financially for my parents. Okay, and God worked as I watched my mom and dad step into their faith. Things happened in amazing ways. People began to support our families. Family members came and supported us. And so sometimes God brings the provision to us. But then there's other times that God gives us the strengths and the energies and the skills to go out and do the work we need to do to provide for ourselves. Okay, so there's this interesting interplay of faith and works that go hand in hand as we do this. So now let's move on to what I call the confusing verse. And forgive us our debts as we forgive ourselves. As we ourselves have forgiven our debtors. There, just learn to read, I guess. And so we move away from this idea of kind of physical necessities to begin looking at how God provides for our spiritual necessities. And now I call this the confusing verse because every time we get to this spot in the prayer, especially if you're not in this church, there might be hesitation. You know, if you go to the Presbyterian church or other ones, you're going to say a different word at this part. And so anytime you come together ecumenically, it's always a wonder, well, how are they going to say it? Because some use debts, we use trespasses here in the Methodist Church, and there's some that take a more contemporary version and just say sins. Okay, and so if I did my research right, the reason we say trespasses is because in the early 1500s, a guy named William Tyndale began to put together an English prayer book in which he began to copy or created the first version of the Bible into the English language or into these prayers. And so rather than using the word debts, he used the word trespasses. And that has carried down and into our denomination. And so that's why when we say the Lord's Prayer, we say trespasses. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go someplace where I'm going to say we're going to change our Lord's Prayer. I'm not saying that. So we'll continue to say trespasses. But for me, the word debt has a much deeper meaning than trespasses does. Because when I think about debts, it's something that I owe. And when I think about the sin that I have in my life, it's a debt that I simply cannot pay. Now, when we use trespasses and sins, it seems like, well, you know what, God, I've missed the mark, I just get another chance. Okay, that's just my personal interpretation. So, as a word guy, debt has a deeper meaning for me than those other words. And so, as we look at this verse, we're called to forgiveness. Okay? And we're called to forgiveness because God first forgave us. Because of those sins, because of that debt we owed that we just simply couldn't pay ourselves, God sent His Son Jesus to pay that debt for us. Okay? And if you remember back when I first got here, if you don't worry about it, but I told you a story about a young man, or a man whose son was working as a pizza delivery guy, trying to pay his way through college. And one night he was out delivering pizzas, and a bunch of gang members who were in a gang initiation came up to him and said, you know what, you got to give us the pizzas or we're going to kill you. And the kid didn't give him the pizzas, and so they shot him and they killed him. And so this man, his name is Azim Khamisov, had to go not only through the grief of losing his son to horrific violence, but had to step into forgiveness because he realized that not only had he lost a son, but this other family was going to lose a son too, because this young man would find himself in prison for the things that he had done. And so in an amazing act of grace and forgiveness, he created a relationship with the grandfather of this other young man, and they created an organization that now goes around and educates elementary schools on the power of gang violence and gang initiation and stuff. And so a beautiful example of bridging that gap and seeing forgiveness in true action. Now, just because we forgive someone doesn't mean that that person just skates clear and free. What it means is that we no longer want to see them suffer because of their debt against us. Okay? So now this young man still had to face time in prison and do that, so he received his consequences. As we look at this, to forgive, Dallas Willard has a really interesting take on this, and he says, if we think of forgiveness as pity, we get very close to the true meaning of this verse. Okay, now oftentimes we don't like the word pity because it makes us think, well, we're just feeling sorry for someone, and that seems really demeaning to people. And yet he said that that's really the true meaning of forgiveness, that God looks at us for who we truly are. He sees us just naked and made from the dust that we are. He sees everything within us, and He has pity on us because of our brokenness. Okay? And so this is what it's like too, then when we look out across someone else and we're able to have pity for that person, that we truly feel sorry for the things that they've done, for the things that have led them to make those decisions or to say those words or whatever it is. And I think it's really an interesting take, so I would encourage you again to think of the word pity when it comes to forgiveness, because oftentimes we will use words like mercy or compassion to describe forgiveness as well. And those words definitely are synonymous with that, but they have a different meaning. Again, it's almost like, well, they've kind of missed the mark, so we're just going to say, okay, you get another chance. And so again, that doesn't always hit our ego as hard as the pity, to know that God actually feels sorry for us, for the state that we're in. Okay? So I've got two examples for this. The first one Dale's going to cue up for a moment, but you get a nerdy example and you get a biblical example. So, you know, I've told you guys for a long time that I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and so there's a beautiful short 2-minute clip that I'm going to show you where one of the main characters, or a couple of the main characters, talk about pity and the role that it plays in